Good afternoon, everyone. First, I want to thank Reverend Munter and Dr. Andrew of the Bethlehem Institute for Peace and Justice, and my colleague Ranjan Solomon of the Indo-Palestine Solidarity Network for honoring me in this way by asking me to participate in this wonderful and important course. I want to acknowledge also the courageous and prophetic spirit of the Indian Women's Theological Forum, the Association of Theologically Trained Women in India, and the Indian Christian Women's Network. I wish that I could be with you in real time, but for the realities of time zones, but I'm grateful to Zoom for allowing us to have this exchange. I hope that you will share your questions and your thoughts and reactions in the chat, or however the organizers have asked you to do that, so that I can record a response to you and send it back to you. I look forward to that very much. I speak to you from Portland, Oregon in the United States. I acknowledge the indigenous people on whose land I sit: Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Chinook, Tualatin, Wasco, and Molalla. I want to begin my remarks by just mentioning the recent action taken by the State of Israel late last year, against 6 Palestinian human rights organizations. Israel has charged them with association with so-called terrorist organizations in order to effectively shut them down. This is an old trick. We'll touch on this later. Many of us involved with the Palestinian struggle know the work of these organizations well. Their tireless and courageous work is an expression of the refusal of the Palestinian people to be erased and to cease their commitment to the life and culture and future of their people and their society. The good news is that there has been significant pushback from Israel, on Israel, from human rights organizations here in the United States and across the world, including from some Jewish organizations. Israel is being watched. Public opinion is shifting. And I think this supports the case that I'll make, that we have reached a tipping point. The issues that we take on when we address the question of Palestine today are bigger and broader than the struggle of one particular people for liberation. Furthermore, confronting Zionism itself extends beyond the devastating impact that this ideology has had on the Palestinian people. With the question of Palestine, we step onto not only a political, but a theological battlefield. The theological and political discussion about Palestine today takes us back to the 1st century, the context in which Jesus pursued his ministry, where the distinctions between politics and theology that we hold today didn't exist. And that's why the church is so important for the struggle today. And we'll get nowhere in the movement for human rights for Palestinians if we do not take on the theological and the hermeneutical issues that stand in the way of action. The topic I've been asked to speak about is Zionism, a critical Jewish perspective. The question raised by this title is, well, which Zionism, Jewish or Christian? And then there's a follow-on question, which Jewish Zionism and which Christian Zionism? I'm confident that in the course of the 3 months of this course, much of this will be covered that I won't have a chance to go into today. But I will begin with Jewish Zionism and some insight on what that is from my own experience, having grown up with it as a Jew. Then I'll discuss Christian-Jewish relations since World War II in view of the two events that have been so hugely formative in Christian-Jewish relations, as well as in Christian theology, the genocide of the Jews of Europe and the founding of the State of Israel. And then I'll discuss Christian Zionism and what it means for the church to recognize its influence, the influence of Christian Zionism over church history, and particularly why it is critical that churches, Christians, and Christians in the many contexts over the world take this on as a critical issue. Again, not only for the cause of the Palestinians, but for the cause of justice everywhere. And as many theologians who have been in the forefront of liberation struggles have recognized recently, for the sake of the gospel itself. And if, as you notice how much time I spent talking about the church, you begin to ask yourself, how is this a Jewish perspective? Well, here's my answer. For me, it all leads back to Jesus, that Jewish iconoclast, idol smasher in the best Jewish tradition, that radical reformer of his own church of the time, if you will, of his own Jewish society and the errors in which the Jewish leadership fell into. And finally, Jesus, the leader of a grassroots movement against tyranny, the domination system of Rome that was laying waste not only to the Jewish society of Palestine, but for Jesus, to the ethical and community-based system of Torah. To me, Jesus was the best Jew. And my message goes out to his followers today to do what he would do if he were to be standing in front of the temple of injustice that today has been built in Jerusalem. He would say, destroy this temple. Bring it down, not with an army, but with the Spirit. Protect the people of God, and that would be all people, not just one tribe or one family. Not with fortress walls that divide and ideologies of exceptionalism and triumphalism, but with a message of universal love and compassion. That's, if you will, is a Jew's critical perspective on Zionism today. So allow me to begin by saying a few words about my own story, my own process of leaving Zionism. I was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1948. That was the year of the birth of the state of Israel, and 3 years since the end of World War II. And if you're born into a traditional Jewish family in the USA, in the years following the establishment of the state of Israel, you were raised in a very potent combination of rabbinic Judaism, traditional Judaism, and political Zionism. I was taught that I had been blessed to have been born at a time when my people had been redeemed from 2,000 years of slaughter and oppression. I was taught, furthermore, that as a Jew, I lived in a very dangerous world, that I could trust only my own kind. And that further, there were two peoples in particular whom I had to hate and fear. The Germans, because of what they had done to us, and the Arabs, as we called them, because of what they would do to us if we didn't have the state of Israel. And something deep within me rebelled against this basis for defining myself, this basis of identity and worldview. I hadn't quite realized it, but there was a fortress, a wall that had been built within me, separating me from the rest of humankind. And then by the grace of God, I was led to Palestine to meet this presumed enemy. I stood before the wall of concrete and steel that my people had built to separate us from them. I felt at that moment that wall within me. I understood it. And I knew what I had to do. And indeed, I did breach that wall. I met the Palestinians, these enemies, purported enemies, and like Jacob reunited with his brother Esau, I saw the face of God. I learned that despite the wrong that had been done to them, they didn't fear me, they didn't hate me. I met the Palestinian Christians, and I was introduced to their liberation theology. And I realized that the teachings of Jesus, that Palestinian Jew of long ago, spoke directly to the values that I had been taught, that had been implanted in me in my study of the Jewish prophets. I've had to patiently explain to people that in embracing the teachings of Jesus, I have not converted to Christianity. I remain a Jew. In fact, I've become the best Jew that I can be, the Jew I had always been looking for. Through my work for the liberation of Palestine, I've been able to surmount the wall that had been built in my heart and to join the community of humanity, instead of being enclosed behind the fortress walls that we Jews have built in a tragic and fruitless attempt to heal our collective trauma. I'll talk more about that. I treasure my tradition. I feel great love for my people, so that when I talk about what has happened to my people and the great wrongs we have committed, I do this with profound grief, with horror, and with compassion, and with the hope that someday we will dig ourselves out of the hole that we now find ourselves in, that we will forgive ourselves for what we have done and resolve to leave Zionism behind. I also come to this as an American who, in parallel fashion, has had to unlearn the mythology about our own nation's founding that until recently, very recently, has erased the recognition of our original sins of genocide, ethnic cleansing of the indigenous, and chattel slavery. I've now come to understand my country in terms of our colonial settler DNA. This is now being expressed in what we're calling in the United States critical race theory and in the whole concept of whiteness. Thus, my journey from Zionism and my awakening to the reality of my heritage as an American are of one piece. Add to this the work I've been privileged to do with churches in the United States and around the world. The response of the global church to the liberation cry of the Palestinians is a key component of the Palestinian struggle. Working for Palestine today brings us back again to the first century, which was the context of the gospel narrative of a grassroots movement against tyranny. That's why the church is so critical. So, first heading, and I'll be glad to send you this paper. First heading, church struggle. This concept first emerged in the Nazi era when the confessing church under Bonhoeffer and Barth and others emerged in opposition to the wholesale and willing complicity of the German Lutheran Church with the National Socialist regime. In the second half of the century, the term was adopted by the South African churches in the anti-apartheid struggle. It denotes the struggle of the church between its faithfulness to gospel principles of equality, justice, and compassion, and preserving its institutional identity and stability by aligning with power, even at the cost of collaboration with tyranny. This internal conflict goes way back in church history and points us directly to the relationship between the church and colonialism itself. We can trace that, of course, to the doctrine of discovery of the 16th century, but really we can all go all the way back to Constantine in the 4th century, when he embraced Christianity as the official religion of empire. The ecumenical movement was and continues to be an arena in which this fundamental struggle of the church between its institutional nature and its faithfulness to core gospel principles plays out. It had its birth between World War I and World War II, actually, with Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Karl Barth. And they were very much part of setting out the theological and ecclesiological principles at stake. Back then, it was about pacifism and not going back to war. But very quickly, that shifted to the broader principles that underlie conflict within and between nations. Bonhoeffer asked the question, what is the true church? Was it, in his context, the confessing church, which he had founded? Or was it the so-called, quote, German church, the Deutsche Christen, which had allied with the Nazi regime? Fast forward to the Black liberation movement in the United States in the mid-20th century, sometimes called the Civil Rights Movement, which demonstrated the power of the church to actively engage with society and to exert a direct influence in the political arena. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail sets out the terms of the struggle very clearly. Recall that King was writing to his fellow clergymen who were advising caution to go slow, don't rock the boat. But King said to act boldly and with uncompromising moral clarity is what God demands of us, to act as the early followers of Jesus did in challenging the injustice of the society in which we lived. I assume that you in India are, and I think King visited India, didn't I think he visited Gandhi, or maybe no, he never got there, but the two of them seem so closely related in so many ways. So I'm sure you're familiar with the letter from Birmingham jail. It's one of the towering documents of contextual theology of the 20th century. And it's mercifully short. He wrote it on scraps of paper in jail. Anyway, back to ecumenicism. The World Council of Churches, which was the institution by which the ecumenical movement revived itself after the interruption of World War II, founded the program to combat racism in 1969. In so doing, the church, speaking and acting as a global ecumenical body, declared that racism was the compelling issue of our times. In the face of fierce opposition from member churches in the North, the program to combat racism funded national liberation movements in Africa, armed movements, but they funded them. Even though as Christians they had to be officially pacifist. The World Council of Churches was accused of aiding and abetting terrorism. Here we are again with this old trick. We see the same charge now directed at churches who support the Palestinians' resistance to the theft and colonization of their land. We saw a similar response on the part of the Roman Catholic Church to Latin American liberation theology when the Holy See sought to discredit those churches and clergy taking up the cause of the poor by associating it with godless communism. And finally, in the latter part of the 20th century, the church's response to legalizing systemic injustice came to a head perhaps most visibly and famously in the case of South Africa. We'll come back to these themes, but let's move on to the next heading, Kairos theology, church theology. The Cairo, South Africa 1985 document titled Significantly a Challenge to the Church is a brilliantly and powerfully articulated call to the churches to reject the theological and ecclesial complicity with power. Again, along with the letter from Birmingham jail, this is the contextual theology document of the 20th century. And one of the amazing things that it does is it introduces the concept of church theology. Now, church theology, which it opposes, contrasts with prophetic theology, twists and distorts theology to support and maintain the system of domination and power. It defines concepts such as reconciliation, nonviolence, and justice to serve the needs and the program of the oppressor. Again, it's an old story. For example, in church theology, violence is the resistance of the oppressed, not the structural and overt violence of the state. Here, again, I'll cite these. We need to look at the work of Walter Benjamin and Jacques Derrida, who articulate this theoretically in brilliant fashion. Along with a letter from Birmingham jail, the South Africa Kairos document stands as, oh, I said that already. I was anticipating myself. You need to read it. It is in this tradition that we now have 2009 Kairos Palestine Moment of Truth, written by the Palestinian churches and activists, but all from the church in Palestine. It's called, again, A Moment of Truth, a word of faith, hope, and love from the heart of Palestinian suffering. I'm sure that you'll learn more about this in other lectures. Kairos Palestine 2 was a call from the church to resist tyranny. You can say that the Kairos Palestine document initiated public theology in the 21st century. That's a big claim, and I will stand by it, and I'm sure that my colleagues in Palestine will stand by it as well. It's still being written in subsequent documents, which I'm sure you'll also be introduced to. Palestinian Christians have, since 2009, and actually even before that, produced powerful, powerful theological documents in the best tradition of public theology. The Kairos Palestine document 2009 spawned a host of Kairos documents from every continent, each responding to the Palestinian call from its own context of struggle, and in some cases confession. And it launched a movement, what is now a global network of church-related organizations. There's more to say about the global South here, if we're talking globally, and the powerful documents of liberation theology that are emerging from the South, in particular, in support of the Palestinians. Brazil, Korea, India, South Africa, other African countries as well. This global dynamic is a really important factor to consider in the developing strategy to mobilize the churches globally to change the policies of governments and international bodies on a global level. Again, the model is South Africa. There's a whole story of how South African clergymen turned around the Reformed Alliance, of the Alliance of Reformed Churches in the early 80s, and that made a huge difference geopolitically. Of course, this term global South is not really geographically accurate. The North-South dimension really denotes the formerly colonized and the colonizers, as you know. So there's great power in the flow of support to Palestine originating from these countries, and it underscores the point that Palestine is an entry point that unites all who struggle for justice and equality in a world that still struggles mightily with the legacy of colonialism. Turning for a moment to the north, the US and the UK and Germany and other European countries have also written their own responses from their own contextual perspectives, and the UK and the United States we've written our own documents. And our context, of course, is the responsibility of the West for colonialism in its many forms over the centuries. From England and the United States, we have confessions of complicity for what is happening in Palestine today, direct complicity, ongoing complicity. The point that must be understood here is that it is the churches that have led the way. The most hopeful thing that has happened is that out of Kairos Palestine, which has been an organization since 2009, a coalition of organizations called Global Kairos for Justice has arisen to network and to link member organizations and churches in a strategy for action. And I'm sure you've been introduced to Call to Action, Cry for Hope, which comes directly from this global coalition. I'm going to make the case that it's the churches who will be the necessary component to change the political wind. The church has done it before. The civil rights movement began as a church movement. Its leaders were pastors, organizing their work according to principles of resistance derived directly from the Gospels. Read that Martin Luther King letter. The anti-apartheid movement owed much of its spiritual and organizing powers of church leaders, most of them still unknown to the West, with the exception of Desmond Tutu. When the Alliance of Reformed Churches in 1982, as a response from a demonstration on the part of South African clergy at their conference in Ottawa, Canada in 1982, they refused to sit down with them at the communion table. They said, we can't do this in our country. We're officially segregated in our churches. And the alliance declared itself in status confessionis. did the Protestant equivalent of excommunicating the member churches of South Africa that were practicing apartheid. And that just was huge directly in bringing all the churches of the world to help isolate the South African government. It was the beginning of the end. So that story and others demonstrates how the churches can make a difference. It was true then, and it's true now. And the Palestinian call has brought the church, I would say it's the Palestinian call that has named the church struggle for our times, not just for the Palestinians, but for all of humankind in this desperately critical time for the world. Next heading, post-World War II theology, Zionism, and Christian-Jewish relations. So I want to begin by addressing a few words to the issue of what to do about my people, Jewish people, with respect to the challenge to the church to stand with the Palestinians. It's a crucial question, and it's often the elephant in the room, the issue that is huge, but that nobody will talk about directly. After World War II, with the ovens of the death camps still smoldering, the Christian world, beginning in Germany, but quickly spreading west to the United States, and then to basically all of Christendom, embarked on an urgent project to purge Christianity of its anti-Judaism, to confess its sins against the Jews, and to build bridges of trust and reconciliation and healing with the Jewish people. At its heart was a renunciation of replacement theology, also called supersessionism, the doctrine that was responsible for so much Jewish suffering at the hands of the church. You are privileged to have Reverend Munter, who will tell you all you need to know about replacement theology and how to understand it. And I'm sure you have his book. So anti-supersessionism was a good and important project, but the pendulum has swung too far. In the course of atoning for anti-Judaism, mainstream Christian theology has restored the idea that one people or group is specially loved by God. In the process of renouncing the demonization of the Jews, the post-war penitence project, this post-war project of penitence for anti-Semitism, has brought back the idea of chosen people, most beloved of God. And with that comes privileges, including a land grant. It's put Christian theology across the confessional and theological spectrum on a slippery slope to the embrace of Zionism, which is an ethnic, nationalist, racist ideology and theology. It flies directly in the face of core gospel principles of anti-territoriality and universalism. Articulated by prominent mainstream Protestant German theologians in the post-war period. I have another paper that I can send you about that. It spread quickly to the United States, and it remains normative in mainstream Christianity in the West, as well as in the South, even in those societies and churches that are all too familiar with the struggle of oppressed peoples against colonial tyranny. And the fact of the matter is that in embracing Zionism, Christians and the churches have turned their back on Jesus. They've gotten him wrong. I'm speaking to women here. I don't need to tell you that. Mostly we're speaking to men, but there are women theologians as well, very liberal and progressive, that have, just because it's the water we swim in and the air we breathe, have absorbed this. And I'm sure that it's been part of your training as well. So we've got a big job on our hands. And the good news is that Zionism and the cry of the Palestinians and the horrible reality of what's happened to the Palestinian people has brought this issue to the surface. We can see it clearly before our eyes. I know you're going to be talking about India and Hindutva as well. it doesn't matter. Wherever you go, you can find this happening across the board in other faith traditions. But it's alive and well in plain sight in mainstream Christianity. To me, the Jewish Jesus was the Jesus that stood before the temple, the church establishment of his time, if you will, and said, this has to come down to be replaced with my body, one universal humanity, united in compassion and equality. This is the message of Pentecost, to leave Jerusalem, leave this sense of God on one mountain and one people of God, one particular people of God, to leave Jerusalem and to go out into the wide world, speaking all the languages of humankind and bringing the good news that God's love is for everyone, not just one people, and that God is to be worshiped everywhere in the Spirit. Yes, the church has to answer for millennia of Jewish suffering, but this is not the heart of the matter today. The call of Palestine to the church is urgent, indisputable, and must be answered. It overrides considerations of guilt and shame over past Jewish suffering. But to many Christians who recognize their obligation to stand with the Palestinians, many continue to feel that they cannot move forward without explicit or implicit permission from Jewish community leaders. Another way that this is manifested is through entering into what we call dialogue, Christian-Jewish dialogue with Jews about the question of Zionism and Israel. Unfortunately, the pursuit of this dialogue comes with unwritten rules. The rules governing Christian-Jewish interfaith dialogue today dictate that you may acknowledge Palestinian suffering, but you may not challenge fundamental Zionist assumptions. You must accept the claim made by those who claim to represent all Jews that Jewish identity is inseparable from allegiance to the state of Israel, and that Zionism and that Judaism are one and the same. You must accept the assumption that the state of Israel is absolutely essential for Jewish survival. You must never be so politically and theologically incorrect, now we're getting into theology, as to say that the Old Testament is fundamentally tribal and that the New Testament is universal. But I say to you that this is precisely the case. It all comes down to Jesus. Jesus was taking Jerusalem where it was taking Judaism where it needed to go, lifting it from the idea of a covenant between God and one family and later one nation into the realm of the universality and ultimate grace of God's love for all of humankind. And that was, I submit to you, a very Jewish thing for Jesus to do. That was the way for him to be the most faithful to the core of how he understood the Jewish tradition. Consider how he initiated his ministry in the synagogue in Nazareth on that Sabbath. He unfurled the scroll of the prophet Isaiah and declared the day of the Lord's favor to free the captives and give sight to the blind. In doing so, he was declaring spiritual war on empire and tyranny. But have no doubt it was a radical break from the tribalism and exclusivity of the original covenant. You need to read Gary Burge, and I will let you have a good resource for that. The New Testament scholar who said, look, why did they want to throw Jesus over the cliff? It was not for unfurling the scroll of Isaiah. It's because he mentioned the Phoenicians and the Syrians. That was an unpardonable sin. He was saying, this includes them. That was not okay. But Jesus knew what he was doing. So the church has to unapologetically and proudly own this break from the Old Testament narrative and worldview. In spite of the fact that in today's environment, if you do that, you subject yourselves to being called anti-Semitic for saying such things. Besides Gary Burge, you should read Stephen Pryor from Ireland, a Catholic priest who's done wonderful writing, not well enough known. Some of you may know Pryor's work. Again, you'll get the reference. Pryor, who famously said, "Do we want to worship the God of ethnic cleansing?" Pryor, who said, "It's not the Pentateuch, it's the Hexateuch. What about the book of Joshua? Consider that." The bold truth is that when you come to terms with these basic theological principles, you have no choice but to renounce Zionism in both its secular and religious forms, Christian or Jewish, as the basis for ordering human affairs in the Holy Land or anywhere, or in religious discourse anywhere. My conviction is that the church must look to its own house and not wait for the institutional Jewish community to come around to challenging the concept of a Jewish state. I pray that we, my people, will get there, but this is our own house cleaning. This is our own internal Jewish conversation. You need to let us have that, and you must look to your own house. The message of Palestine to world Christians is that if you want to truly reclaim the Jewish Jesus, and that's the only Jesus there is, you must be willing to pick up the cross of being accused of anti-Semitism when you support the Palestinian cause. Next heading, confronting Christian Zionism. It's impossible to overestimate the power and influence of Christian Zionism in its varied forms. Christian Zionism is deeply expressive of what liberation theologian Walter Wink called the domination system. Zionism provides the theological armature on which systems of oppression are built. I'm going to say that again. Zionism provides the theological armature on which systems of oppression are built. In modern times, Zionism has provided the justification for tyranny, masquerading as a Jewish liberation movement and abetted significantly by support from Christians in the institutional church across the denominational spectrum. The crisis for the church in confronting the question of Palestine revolves around how we understand the Bible. Robert Smith and Don Wagner in the United States and Munter Isaac in Palestine, our own Munter, have written about the foundations of Christian Zionism in the English Reformation and the way it is manifested in evangelical Christianity. Stephen Sizer in the UK, and Munter and Naim Atik, Johanna Katanachu, also from the Bible College, and Mitri Raheb in Palestine, have done important work in helping us to understand the urgent theological questions raised by Christian Zionism. I also refer you to christianzionism.org. You just spell it out, christianzionism.org. An excellent website intended principally for evangelical as well as mainline Christians. It's masterfully done, and it introduces believing Christians gently yet clearly to the questions that need to be confronted about what Christian Zionism really is, and is it really the kind of Christianity that you want to follow. In traditional Christian Zionism, the establishment of the state of Israel is seen, as you know, and there will be a lot of talk about this in the course, it's seen as bringing the end times closer, right? You know, when the last Jew is expelled from Jerusalem, Jesus will come back the next day. At least half the Christians in the world would agree that this theology is non-biblical. But this worldview has a strong hold. It's this form of Christian Zionism that we usually talk about, but we also need to talk about the Christian Zionism that is hiding in plain sight in mainline Christianity. It does not incorporate the end times eschatology, but it shares a worldview that is exclusionary and triumphalist. And that basically, just like Lord Balfour did in 1917, writes out the deed to the entire land. Sorry about the indigenous population that is inconveniently there. And this worldview is very much represented in the post-war Philo-Judaic theology that I talked about earlier. It's all of a piece. It's also important to recognize there is a large swath of evangelical Christians, particularly in the United States, who have been to Palestine, seen the reality on the ground, and on that basis are willing to take a hard look at their theology and their understanding of biblical promises. Also, consider what happens when African Americans, Black people in the United States, go to Palestine, or when South Africans, post-apartheid South Africans, and of course, before that as well, when apartheid was in full bloom, have visited Palestine, and they all say, we know what this is. South Africans say this is actually worse than the apartheid that we had. They say that. But white evangelicals visit Palestine, and they come back and they say, we need to take another look at our theology and our Bibles. The Christ at the Checkpoint conferences conducted by the Bethlehem Bible College have been largely devoted to bringing in this population, and they've been hugely successful and influential. But we need to talk to the mainline churches as well about their theology and their hermeneutic. This theological work is ongoing by the Palestinian theologians and continued in the work of people in the UK and Germany and the United States, and of course in South Africa. Also worthy of mention is the excellent work of Jewish Voice for Peace in the United States. Visit their website, they've got great material. The Palestine-Israel networks, their mission committees within the US denominations, particularly the United Church of Christ and the Presbyterian Church USA. They've done exceptionally good work, and those websites are also available. You can also find all of this material on PalestinePortal.org, and I'll make sure that your professors get and organizers get these links. Next heading, the Jewish predicament and the Christian dilemma. We Jews are trapped in victimhood. We are a case of undiagnosed, unresolved post-traumatic stress disorder. From my work as a psychologist, that's what I was in my former life, I know that the treatment of choice for people who have been traumatized over generations is not to put them in a fortress, post soldiers on the fortress walls, and promote the message that the world is a dangerous place. Trust no one. Because the real injury for trauma, whether it's long, cumulative, and for Jews it's 2 millennia, or whether it's one single event, is damage, sometimes irreparable, to the sense of trust in the world, being able to connect, to love in a way, and to form relationships that are productive and trustful. That's been damaged because of what's been done to you. Failure to treat this, to find a way to come back from that, leads to a permanent loss of these fundamental human abilities. This is for people and as for collectives and groups as well. But the greater tragedy, as we well know, is that the victims then turn around to become the victimizers. I mean, this was the case of the Afrikaners. You know, they've been victimized by the British. They turned around and they said, well, we've got to get what's ours, and God wants us to do this, and we will take this land and we will effectively enslave the people. That's a real component of what happened with the Jews. So it adds to the settler colonialism that, you know, God wants us to reclaim this land, to take this land for God and goodness. But this turnaround to becoming the victimizers is what we see in modern day Israel. What we Jews must do, and this has begun particularly among the young, is to realize that Zionism is not the solution to anti-Semitism, confess that the resort to ethnic nationalism was an understandable wrong turn, leading to crimes for which ultimately we need to forgive ourselves, and that in order to recover from our suffering and to learn to trust, we must join the wider world of humanity, break down those fortress walls in which we've enclosed ourselves, And by the way, embrace our Palestinian brothers and sisters with whom we now share the land. We're all home there now. We can build a home there now. But, and here I turn again to speak to Christians, the theological and hermeneutical issues must be confronted because they stand in the way of moving toward the political solution that will allow this healing to happen. So Christians face a different challenge because here's what happened. In the reaction of horror to the genocide of the Jews of Europe by Christian Europe, Christians missed the opportunity for deep self-reflection. The horror of what anti-supersessionism, the horror about anti-Judaism should have produced not a reversion and a re-embrace of a theology of specialness and chosenness and a guilt offering of land, but rather an understanding that it was that very theology of exceptionalism and triumphalism, Christian, that allowed the genocide to happen. It was the church's wrong turn way back that led to Hitler. I ask myself, what would Bonhoeffer say today, contemplating Christian support for Zionism? What would he say about this guilt offering of specialness and privileged right to Palestine that you've granted to the Jewish people, a gift which provides you with a free ride back to your own exceptionalism? If the Jews are chosen, we're in the house of Israel, we're chosen. It's holding on to the same basic theology and worldview. In a betrayal of the Gospels, Christians embraced the notion of God's special people. So first giving it back to the Jews and then hitching a ride on it. The Philo-Judaic theology of the post-war period produced the concept of the, quote, Judeo-Christian tradition, about which is basically Christian triumphalism on steroids. What we have today is Judeo-Christian triumphalism, and its language is Zionism. To borrow Bonhoeffer's terminology, this is cheap grace. What would be costly grace in Bonhoeffer's terms would be to say to your Jewish sisters and brothers, thou dost evil. To say, I know you're going to call me anti-Semitic, but we have to do what our faith obligates us to do, which is to stand with the oppressed and to pray that someday you will come alongside us. But folks, you can't wait. I don't know. I mean, this is not so probably much an issue in India, but in places in the West, in the North, where, in South Africa, by the way, as well, where a small minority of Jews have such a huge hold on Christian consciousness because of the legacy of church anti-Judaism that is now trying to recover from. We're given much too much power. That's why I just have to say the fact that you are doing this in your seminary, in your seminaries, is wonderful. You're way ahead of us in Europe and in the United States. You've begun a little bit in South Africa. But to bring this kind of curriculum and this kind of dialogue and discourse to the seminaries where the future leaders and theologians are being trained, I can't overestimate the importance of that. So what you're doing, this project, this course is wonderful, and it's extremely important. May your tribe increase. Okay, I'm just about done. Summary, the tipping point. So in summary, why do I believe that we have reached a tipping point? First, the challenge of anti-Semitism leveled at Christians, at critics of Israel, has been around, Christians, leveled at all critics of Israel. That's been around for a while, but today it's being weaponized as never before. Back in the 1970s, neoconservatives in the United States, threatened by the fact that awareness of Israel's crimes was beginning to surface, people were asking questions. They developed the concept of, quote, the new anti-Semitism. The new anti-Semitism being criticism of Israel. See what they've done there. It's the same thing that's happening now. They discredited this, quote, new anti-Semitism by connecting it with the political left. Remember, this was the Cold War. So the political left was threatening all that was good and wonderful about core American values, or white stuff. And so if we're going to protect our traditional, cherished American values, then we cannot allow there to be criticism of Israel. Israel, of course, is the only democracy in the Middle East. It's our friend. We love them. Subtext, they're white Europeans like us. That's the dominant culture. We have to protect that against those brown people. So they said, so you can't criticize Israel. It's anti-Semitic, it's anti-American, it's communist, what have you. Today, the equating of criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism has been revived, but on a broader scale. You see it used against church leaders as well as at the highest levels of national governments. An example is the definition of anti-Semitism produced by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. You may have heard of it, which has been adopted by governments and debated in Christian denominations, which explicitly names criticism of the state of Israel as a form of anti-Semitism. It's a Trojan horse inserted into those discourses. It looks good, but if you read it carefully, it stands right out at you. It's about making sure that Israel is immune from any kind of criticism and questioning. But I think it's good news. It means that those who defend Israel's crimes are now very much on the defensive. And it's being debated at the highest levels. In the halls of the United States Congress back in the summertime, there was a debate about whether or not we should continue to fund Israel's Iron Dome. It's a defense thing to keep all the so-called bombs raining down from Gaza. Some voices, there are only a few now, said that Israel, we shouldn't do that. And they even talked about Israel being an apartheid state. The words apartheid and settler colonialism were both used in the halls of the United States Congress, debating it. They were shouted down, but there it was. Secondly, we've reached a tipping point because churches have awakened as a result of the tireless work of the Palestinian Christians. And please do not accept the Zionist argument that Christians are being victimized by what they call, quote, Palestinian nationalism. That's code for Islam. They may say radical Islam. It's an old trick. And there are no Palestinians who would say that Christians and Muslims are divided in their resistance to Israeli oppression. Christians are leaving the Holy Land, but it's because of Israel. It's not because of their fellow Palestinians. It's absurd. I come back to, and I'll conclude by returning to the concept of church struggle. The church has always struggled. It needs to struggle. That's the living church. That's the awakened and enlivened church. The struggle is going on within churches, but it's also happening between churches, west and east, north and south. Our work today is to mobilize the global church with Palestine as an entry point, but being clear that this is a struggle about a universal phenomenon. Here I commend to you another document entitled Dangerous Memory and Hope for the Future. You'll have access to that too if you haven't already seen it. It emerged from a conference in Johannesburg in 2015. I was privileged to be there on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the Cairo, South Africa document. It's a brief document that talks about Palestine as an entry point for the struggle against tyranny and equality that we are all engaged in as a human community. It talks about the difference between Kairos theology, which was initiated in the New Testament by John and Jesus, but it was brought back by the South Africans in the 80s, and then and then again by the Palestinians in 2009. Just a word also about North and South. The South, again, it's not, I may have already said this, it's not a geographic designation. It means basically the formerly colonized and the colonizers. And the South is extremely important and extremely powerful. That is what's going, that you are going to take the day when when the church, the global church, finally, and it's happening, finally comes around and says, like it said about South Africa, no more. We cannot be with Jesus. We cannot be true to ourselves as Christians, as human beings, and turn a blind eye to apartheid in our time. That's what it comes down to today. And I'll say it again, it's a theological battleground. We have to go back to our Bibles. And the Bible is clear, the whole Bible. Again, you've got to read Burge, you've got to read Sizer, you've got to read Winter Isaac, of course. And we all owe them a great debt. I remember so with such love the time that your teacher, Ranjan, and I spent in Bethlehem. We've met there. I think we've probably also met in South Africa, in the company of our sisters and brothers, the Palestinians. They have taught us so much. Things that we already knew, but needed to be called. So I'll conclude by quoting again from one of my rabbis, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who in 1935, in a wonderful paper, which I commend to you, called The Confessing Church and the Ecumenical Movement, he wrote the following words: theology itself is not the fighting part here. It stands wholly in the service of the living, confessing, and struggling church. That's the core and genius of Bonhoeffer. He did not separate ecclesiology from theology. He did not separate himself and his state and his community from Jesus. He said that's how Jesus manifests in community. He said that too. The living, confessing, and struggling church. Your classrooms, your seminary, that's the community that you build there. That's the church. Bonhoeffer here, writing within the crucible of his own personal, theological, and church struggle, meant that this is the point of doing theology. He understood the church as the community of those who, like Jesus, saw the signs of the times and struggled with the challenges they presented. John de Gruchy, a friend and teacher of mine, a celebrated South African theologian, describes the church as, quote, the community in which God manifests in history. He was channeling Bonhoeffer when he wrote that. I celebrate my membership in this community, and I celebrate the journey that has brought us all together on this day. Thank you.